Welcome to everyone. While everyone comes in and virtually takes their seat, we're just going to pause for a moment and we'll get started soon. Thank you to all of you who are coming in. As we populate the Zoom room here, we're just going to take a moment to pause and let people come in sort of fast and furiously here. We have hundreds of people on our call today, so it'll take a moment for everyone to come in. We'll get started shortly. Okay, well, I'm going to get started so that we can stay on time. People are still populating as you come in. We are going to be letting some other people keep going. Anyway, my name is Lindsay Craig. I'm president of National Review Institute, and we're so pleased to host this today for National Review Institute members all across the country, as well as NR Plus subscribers. So thank you all for supporting the National Review mission in the various ways that you do. It's absolutely imperative during this really critical time that we have your support. And of course, this is the start of our giving season, and we are hoping to continue to connect with all of you throughout this coming year. I know so many of us are pleased that 2020 is almost in the rearview mirror. We've got great signs ahead, maybe new vaccines, wonderful therapeutics to deal with our COVID situation, and that's very promising. But we do have some looming things on the horizon. Certainly the grand and sweeping acceptance of socialism and just the language of socialism is very alarming to us at National Review and Institute and National Review. And so we know that we can't just be doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. So particularly on the Institute side, we're changing up some of our programs, and we're going to be bringing new programs to you throughout 2021 because, well, National Review has had a 65-year history of taking on socialism front on. We are going to be doing that this year. And we look forward to doing that with your support, and we hope that you consider us during this giving season. We also want to make mention that as we're doing these programs virtually, we have really an opportunity to expand our audience, actually almost, unlimited. And so for our 1955 Society members all year long, we want to be able to encourage you to bring a friend and to help us expand, because we know that we're creating a bit of an army here. And these are, as I said, very important times. And the larger the group of members that we have, and the more funds that we can raise to support wonderful people like Kevin Williamson, the stronger that we will be and the better our success will be. So I hope that all of you can help us in this fight, particularly as we enter this season. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to Rich Lowry, who is the editor-in-chief of National Review. Other than that, he probably needs no other introduction, and he will be able to introduce Kevin Williamson and tell you all about Kevin's new book. Rich, you're on mute.
Sorry. Symptom of our age, the failure to mute. We've all been there. Failure to unmute, I should say. Sometimes it's a failure to mute. But I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be with all of you and discuss Kevin's new book, Big White Ghetto. I often joke with Kevin that NR doesn't have a big HR office. So our personnel policy basically consists of our best writers making themselves unemployable at any other place in America. And Kevin, we have now hard proof that Kevin actually succeeded in doing that with his brief stint at the Atlantic. Perhaps Kevin will come out with an anthology of his collected Atlantic works at some point, which I guess would consist of one article about how libertarians aren't such a big deal in the Republican Party at the moment. But Kevin is obviously a brilliant, original, insightful, eloquent writer, and on top of that has two qualities that really separate the great opinion writers from everyone else, which is that he's utterly fearless and utterly incorrigible, which is why he couldn't stick at the Atlantic. It's a sign of Kevin's influence with writers across the board. Just when young fellows and interns start at NR, often the advice I give them is be yourself. Don't try to copy any other writer you admire. And when I tell them that, I'm usually thinking of Kevin Williamson, because young NR writers, it's Kevin that they want to be and they want to imitate. And Kevin does demonstrate how it is theoretically possible to write a good, compelling 800-word sentence, but this is not something I recommend that the average 22-year-old try to do. So I guess I can maybe take credit for this book, Kevin. I think it arose from maybe something I assigned you to do years ago, which is to go to Appalachia or go to some other left behind place and report and write about it. And you've made it a big theme. And it's obviously something that's been on people's mind, the white working class, places that are left behind the last 4 years during the Trump phenomenon. So congratulations again on the book. And we thought we'd give you 10, 15 minutes, give us the synopsis, and then the two of us will discuss it.
Thanks so much, Rich. Yeah, that was your suggestion. Sometimes a little nudge in the right direction can make a big difference. And it was one of those great Rich Lowry emails with 6 words and no vowels in it that I suppose you were typing with your thumbs at that point. So when inspiration strikes, you just have to go after it. Yeah, so this is a book that is a collection of long form reported pieces I did for National Review, sort of partly organized along the themes of poverty and addiction and dysfunction, and some of the other elements of life in parts of the country that are not, I think, very well covered by much of the media, maybe not written about as much or as intelligently as they should be. If there's an organizing theme, it's what I like to call Williamson's first law, which is that everything is really, really simple if you don't know anything about it. But the more you learn about things, particular situations, the more complex they seem, the more nuanced they seem, the less obvious the solutions are. And everyone knows this in their own lives. Everyone knows this in their own area of expertise. That's why Robert Conquest famously said everyone's a conservative about the thing that he knows the most about. And so I've spent a lot of time going to places, talking to people, looking around, trying to learn what's actually going on in those places, because I think that is the kind of journalism that actually creates some real value. I mean, I do both reporting stuff and opinion writing, and I think that probably every 1,000 words of reporting I've done is worth about 75,000 words of opinion giving. And one of the reasons that I think that that's valuable is because the world doesn't actually follow our preferred ideological narratives very well. So I've spent a lot of time writing about Appalachia, and one of the great myths of American life is that poverty causes crime. But in fact, in most of Appalachia, crime rates are relatively low. And the violent crime rate is about half of the national average. And this is in a place that has a lot of drug addiction, a lot of welfare dependency, a lot of the things that we normally associate with those sorts of pathologies. Life in Eastern Kentucky is just really quite different from life in Baltimore and life in Milwaukee and life in Philadelphia. Similarly, I've got a piece in here about Colorado's effort to legalize marijuana. And I think that's probably the right policy, but libertarians have a tendency to try to tell themselves kind of comforting stories about what'll happen if the world only would adopt our policies, then it'll solve all these problems. And there's still a lot of problems associated with marijuana and other drug use in Colorado, including the illegal cultivation and presence of organized crime, that sort of thing. A lot of people get arrested coming out of Colorado into other states where marijuana isn't legal. And the people getting arrested in Nebraska, they don't have 25 grams of marijuana on them, they have 20 pounds of the stuff, which you can't buy legally in Colorado or anywhere else. We've seen similar things with legalizing prostitution in Nevada, which hasn't really done much to relieve problems associated with kind of street level prostitution, places like Las Vegas. So I like to go to places to dig into what's going on and try to notice some of the little details of life. I think those are illuminating. So a lot of the stuff in this book they're unhappy stories. There's section on gambling, section on pornography, section on heroin addiction, section on poverty. There's also some really very good things going out there as well that are also included in the book, particularly things having to do with the energy industry, the way that has transformed some communities and created a lot of economic vitality where it hadn't existed before or hadn't existed as abundantly as it does now. So I try to avoid the ideological wish casting and try to figure out the details of what's actually going on the ground. And I was thinking about this as I was getting ready to do this talk, because it's not a complaint, but this is work that I actually personally find kind of difficult to do. I'm not really naturally an outgoing or sociable person. A lot of you on this call actually know me and are quite familiar with that. Talking to strangers is not something that really comes naturally to me. Asking people uncomfortable questions about things they don't want to talk about makes me uncomfortable as well. And I was thinking, Robert Costa, my former National Review colleague who's now at the Washington Post, is really just the opposite of this. I remember seeing him call, I think it was Mitch McConnell, at home at midnight on a Monday or something like that, and got him out of bed to ask him a question about something and acted like it was just sort of the most normal thing in the world. And he said, well, Senator, if you'll just answer my question, I'll let you get back to bed. I find that kind of thing really quite difficult to do, but I think that it's good to be able to do it, and it's necessary to get people to talk about things they don't want to talk about or things that make them uncomfortable. Although one of the things I've really found is once you get outside of New York and Washington and Los Angeles, is that people are really eager to share their stories. People are often a little hesitant when you first want to interview them. If they're not people who are used to being interviewed, they're not in the media or politics businesses, and they feel a little bit like maybe they're on a trip to the principal's office, like they've done something wrong. Why is this person asking me these questions? But then once you actually get them talking about their lives and their experiences and their aspirations and their insights, people seem to be, I think, really quite interested in telling their stories and having their stories told. Sometimes people congratulate me for my sympathy or empathy, as we sometimes call it, which is the wrong word, but it's a word we use a lot. A lot of people criticize me for lacking those qualities. One of the things I tried to do in these stories is actually to keep sympathy to a minimum, because I think it's something that often gets in the way of the reporting. A lot of our journalism is marred and disfigured, I think, by this sort of performative empathy by which journalists want to paint themselves as kind of heroic figures and look at me and how much I care and how sympathetic I am and how sensitive I am to these things. And it's a way of putting themselves at the center of the story in a heroic kind of way. I think that's really it's dishonest journalistically. I think we should be plain about the facts, including the facts about ourselves and our reactions to things. Sometimes I react to things in ways that I'm not especially proud of, but I try to keep those in the story as well, because I think they're part of the facts of the case that need to be discussed. And I think that those little details of life are what really adds up to a bigger, more useful, richer picture of things. So I don't think that there's any way for us to advance without really taking account of the facts. And the facts often are complex, they are unpopular, they aren't really very much used to people who are trying to win elected office or to sell you something, but they're really all that we have to go on. And so I think that this kind of journalism is valuable for that reason. And of course, I'm very grateful to National Review for giving me the opportunity to pursue it, and certainly grateful to all of you who have supported this work and who are here today. By the way, I'm glad that the 331 of you who are currently on this call did not come to my first book launch party back in the old days when we did things in person, because we had an open bar at that party. And if we had 331 people there, I think I'd still be paying it off. And the book didn't make that much money. So thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoy the book. And I think Rich and I will now talk for a little bit about this. Assuming Rich comes back.
Sorry, I had to do so much. I had to unmute and restart my video. So Kevin, that was wonderful. So yeah, let's dive in. So one interpretation you'll hear of the Big White Ghetto is, look, a place like Appalachia, it's always been poor. It's always been isolated throughout our entire history. So what is new or interesting about this?
Yeah, that's something I actually get into in the book. There are places in the country that have economic problems and social problems related to those economic problems because there was a kind of economic disaster for them. That, Detroit is an example of this, where the decline of the auto industry was something that just didn't really ever recover from. Other parts of Kentucky are like this, around Harlan and places that are coal mining places. The decline of that business really hit things and hit people who live there very hard. The place that I mostly write about is called Alsey County, which never really had anything like that. It was never a coal mining place, was never a big manufacturing place. There wasn't some big industry that went away. And I think it is the case that these places always have been relatively poor. They always have been relatively isolated. And their poverty seems more striking because the rest of the country has grown wealthier and less psychologically and emotionally tolerant of this kind of poverty. We don't have the sort of poverty in the United States, even in the very poorest parts of the United States, that you see elsewhere in the world. I began my journalism career in India, where there's a whole different breed of poverty. And we're talking about different things, obviously, in the United States than we're talking about in, say, Pakistan. But it affects us in a way that maybe it didn't in the 1930s or 1940s or even the 1970s and 80s, when it was more, I think, generally accepted, wasn't seen as much of a problem as it was, kind of way of life. And that, I think, should at least inform our responses to it, to the extent that there isn't any really obvious public policy response to this. It's not like we're going to create some Appalachian enterprise zone and turn things around in these places. And most of the people who are potentially high wage, highly skilled, productive workers have already left or do so shortly after finishing high school and don't come back. And this contributes to what I call the socioeconomic salton-sea effect, that as the population gets smaller, the pathologies become more concentrated. There's a big difference between being a poor person in a poor community and being a poor person in a community that isn't poor. Because if you grow up in a place that isn't poor, even if you are poor, there's a lot of social capital available to you. My own situation, I grew up in a pretty poor family, but I grew up in a college town. So most of my friends' parents were, they were professors and professionals and doctors and lawyers and things like that. And I could benefit from their social capital and their experiences and their advice and that sort of thing. But a lot of people in places like the South Bronx, if you're looking at the cities, or places like Eastern Kentucky, if you're looking at the countryside, you've got 15, 16-year-olds there who are trying to figure out what to do with their lives, and they've never known anyone who went to college. They've never known anyone who had a really very good job. Their imagination for what they can do with their lives is pretty limited. And even if they do have some idea, the practical realities of getting from where they are to where they want to be require a lot of information and connections, I think, that they just don't have. And I think that is something that maybe we actually can do something about. We can create broader networks of helping people to learn about opportunities and resources that are available to them.
So with regard to the example of Detroit, there's an argument, we hear it a lot from the populist right, hear it a lot from someone like Tucker Carlson, that, actually that's a really apt analogy. And maybe it's not true of Appalachia, which has been poor for a very long time, but it's true of other parts of the country. It's true of the Rust Belt, other places where we're seeing a rise of these terrible social dysfunctions, that they are like Detroit. They relied on industries or parts of the economy that have gone away, and perhaps have gone away as a result of ill-considered policies, particularly trade policies. So maybe we'll just focus on that for a second. Trade. What is your take on what role trade policy has or hasn't had in immiserating the white working class?
Yeah, I think that it has mostly had not much of an effect. On balance, trade, of course, has been good for working class Americans because it creates larger markets for the things that Americans make. But you can look at a few examples of cities like Los Angeles is a good example, where before Los Angeles was an entertainment capital, it was a manufacturing city. And the manufacturing industry declined a bit. The entertainment industry was sort of built up, took its place in some ways. The entertainment industry has declined in some ways as well, too. And manufacturing in some ways has come back to Los Angeles, where there's a lot of smaller scale industrial stuff in Southern California that wasn't there 40 or 50 years ago. So some places are able to weather economics and some aren't. You know, Philadelphia is an example of this, where most of Philadelphia's industrial base really went away over the course of the post-war era as things like shipbuilding just became less important, or shipbuilding, at least in the Port of Philadelphia, became less important than some of the other things that they've been involved in. But they developed a services economy, they developed an economy in finance and medicine, education, some other things. And they were able to really kind of bounce back from that. Detroit is different from those places in that Detroit is really, really badly governed city. It is, arguably the worst governed city in America historically. And what drove people out of Detroit wasn't the decline of the automobile industry, which happened slowly and over a long period of time, very gradually. If you look at Detroit's population between 1960 and 1970, it just crashes. Over the course of a very few years, it's like the entire Black middle class of Detroit, like, as one body, just moved to the suburbs. And that had mainly to do with riots, the decline in the schools, the general lack of safety and law enforcement in the streets. So Detroit, I think, would be a very, very different city than the one it became if it had had a functional city government that could do things like run reasonably good schools, keep the street lights on. At one point, what was it, 60% of the street lights were not functioning in Detroit. There were blocks and blocks and blocks that were dark. In Dallas, where I live, you see some of this stuff too, where the roads here are in many cases just sort of not quite third world, but I'm glad I have an off-road vehicle sometimes driving around town. These are kind of basic things that we expect city, county, and state governments to do and to take care of, but they often don't. A city like Philadelphia has kind of made it in some ways and kind of hasn't made it in some ways, but a Detroit or a Milwaukee or a Cleveland with functioning schools, safe streets, decent municipal infrastructure would be very, very different places from what they became. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's more of, there are a lot of policy failures that are much more significant than changes in the market. And there are always economic changes. New York City doesn't have the same economy it had 10 years ago, much less 50 years ago, but it adapts. And when you've got a good, decent, basic level of competence in public affairs, then that adaptation can take place.
And what's your view of the interaction between economics and social dysfunction? Because again, I'll come back to another Tucker Carlson argument. So for the longest time, you've had folks on the left saying, well, you know what happened to the inner cities? Manufacturing left, prime age males became less employable or earned less. They therefore became less marriageable. And you have this total social breakdown. And we were always on the right, basically, no, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get married, get a high school education, get a job, and then you're gonna be fine. But you've had some folks on the right now saying, you know what, the left was always basically right about that. And what's happened to elements of the white working class is the same thing that happened to the inner cities. The manufacturing leaves, harder to get a job, your wages are a little less, then you're less marriageable, then you have a breakdown of marriage, and all sorts of bad things flow from that. So what is your view on the interaction of economics and social dysfunction?
Yeah, I think that economics is a descriptive science. It tries to tell us what's happening in the world in terms of commerce and exchange and material resources. It doesn't tell us much about how we should live or what we should desire or what we should do. So it's of limited value that way. Yeah, these things are part of a self-reinforcing network where you see a lot of social dysfunction among wealthy people. Hollywood's a great example of this. Conservatives like to talk about, the kind of degeneracy and, drug abuse and sexual promiscuity that was part of the, the heyday of Hollywood, maybe in the 1980s. But when you're very, very wealthy and you have lots of connections, you can kind of minimize the negative impacts that sort of thing has on your life. Keith Richards was never going to end up begging at an intersection because he's a drug addict. He's a very wealthy drug addict, and so at least wealthy former drug addict, and he's got some padding there. So that makes a difference, I think. But at the same time, I don't think that what constrains people from marriage and having children is material so much, because the people who are the most likely, of course, to put off marriage and to put off parenthood tend to be educated, affluent people, not very poor people who are saying, well, I'd love to get married and have some kids, but I just can't afford to right now. Poor folks tend to go ahead and have kids when they think they want to have kids, whether they can afford them or not. I was living in New York City. That was always kind of a really striking thing to me. I was living in the South Bronx and working at National Review, and all my friends in Manhattan who were my age in our mid to late 30s were getting married, starting to have children, that sort of thing. And all my friends in the South Bronx had kids in college, grandchildren, and they were all the same age. And you see this even within in the same families where, I'm recently married, and my brother, who's 2 years older than me, has grandkids. Different people make different decisions for different reasons. I think that one of the problems with employment in poorer areas, both in inner cities and in rural areas, is that there's a really poisonous attitude we have toward work. People don't want to take jobs that are seen as being low status jobs, even if they pay a lot better than the alternative. There are a lot of people who would rather not work as a clerk at 7-Eleven or take a job like that or work in a warehouse, and I've done both of those jobs. Even though it would make their lives a lot better in material terms to do that, because it's seen as something that chumps do, something that nobodies do, and you're sort of confirming your place in the world as a low status person if you take a job like that. Of course, those jobs often are steps toward bigger and better things, and if you don't get on the ladder at some point, you can't climb the ladder. And we saw this with a piece I did for National Review that's not in this collection about this economic development project in the Bronx, where the unions and the local Democrats made a bunch of really unreasonable demands about this project. And so it ended up not happening. It was going to create a bunch of jobs and just didn't. And I went up there to write about that neighborhood and what was going on. And I talked to a guy up there who was, he was around my age. I think I might have been 37 or so at the time. And, local guy from up there, never had a job. Not really ever had a job of any kind in his life. Never really known a man who had a job. A lot of the women he knew had jobs. His mother had a job. But the idea of him going to work in a grocery store is just something that would never even occur to him, I think.
And you mentioned the drug crisis a couple of times. So what are the sources of the opioid crisis in your mind?
Yeah, this is one of those things that's like the story we tell ourselves poverty causes crime. We also tell ourselves poverty causes addiction. I think it's more that addiction causes poverty. Mm-hmm. I went to Alabama, and this piece is in the book. I interviewed 4 young men who were all relatively early stages of recovery from heroin and opioids. And a couple of them were actually from upper middle class, affluent professional families. The other 2 were from sort of regular middle class families. None of them were poor. None of them had grown up in this terrible, privation. The opioid crisis was partly a creation of public policy in the sense that we had a lot of people who were abusing prescription painkillers for recreational purposes. And when it finally occurred to people that this was a wide-scale social problem, they just responded by leaning on the pharmaceutical companies and the doctors to stop writing these prescriptions, which meant that you had a large population of addicted people and no supply of drugs for them. And then we acted surprised when they turned to heroin, which was the nearest thing they could get to what they had been using. And after the crackdown on prescription opiates, we saw a big spike in heroin use and heroin overdoses and all the horrible things that go along with that. I spent some time at a rehab in New Orleans, and this is in the book as well too, talking about their particular issues with that and how many people they get in the emergency room every Friday night for overdoses and all this terrifying stuff. I think that what I learned from those four guys that I wrote about, their problem in life wasn't that they were poor or desperate. It was that they didn't have any sense of where they wanted to be. And if they did have a sense of where they wanted to be, they didn't have a sense of how to get there. And so there wasn't much to them that was as strong as, well, what do I want to do in the next 15 minutes? One of them told the story about the first time he shot up heroin, and the guy he was with, who was a longtime user, he tells him, look, if you do this, you do it one time and there's never going to be any turning back for you. And, his response was, bring it on, let's do it. Now he was probably 15 when he said that. So we're not talking about an adult making decisions with moral culpability and experience of adulthood, but that's where that came from, and these are stories they're difficult to look at because we look at people as adults and say, well, you screwed up and you made bad decisions with your life and now you're in jail. But if you wind that story back far enough, you end up with a 13-year-old kid. And that's the hard part of it.
Yeah, that's I wonder about personal responsibility generally. I did some tutoring and mentoring of kids in New York City who were poor, but kind of were better off than most kids from these neighborhoods, because at least their moms were involved enough and with it enough to get them part of this program, a faith-based program. But these kids, I mean, they're delightful, wonderful kids. They're smart, creative, fun, and just totally screwed by the institutions around them, by their families, by the romance of guns and violence. And so just how do you think about that? Because conservatives were personal responsibility people, but it was much easier for me to be personally responsible coming from a middle-class family, with a bookish English professor as a father and a very engaged, social worker as a mother. I mean, it was hard. It's hard for me to mess it up. I occasionally tried, but it took more effort than I was capable of. Whereas you put me in the environment that these kids are living in the South Bronx, I would ruin my life immediately as a teenager.
Yeah, I thought about this for a piece I wrote for National Review about Allen Iverson. Iverson is someone I've kind of followed a little bit, not because I know much about basketball. I never really followed basketball, but because I used to be the editor of his hometown newspaper in Lower Merion, where he lived when he was playing for the Sixers. And he was always kind of an interesting character to me. And I look at the way he grew up and terrible situation he was in and going to prison for something he didn't actually do and all the rest of it. And I thought to myself that, I grew up in pretty hard circumstances in a lot of ways, but not nearly as hard as that. And if you'd given me the kind of money and fame he had when he was 20 years old or whatever, I'd have turned out a lot worse than Allen Iverson. I'd have turned out just a lot worse than Allen Iverson. I'm less interested in the debate about personal responsibility as a kind of political rhetoric, as in just the reality of the fact that there are a lot of things in life that are maybe not your fault, but they're still your problem. And the only thing that's going to change how life turns out for these people are the decisions they make and what they do themselves. It's not fair that they're put into a terrible circumstance where they have to overcome very, very steep odds, including the influence of their families and their local communities and other really negative influences in their lives often. But that's where they are. And there's no way to change that through some public policy. You can't pass a law that says parents have to be good and love their children and be responsible. It'd be nice if we could pass a law that would accomplish that, but it's not something we can actually do. So what we can do for people, I think, though, is help them respond to incentives by giving them good incentives, by helping people to understand that there really are things you can do with your life to make an enormous difference. I don't think there are a lot of kids in, going to these terrible high schools in the South Bronx who really know that if they finish up high school with a good GPA and do well on some standardized test and otherwise, are pretty good students, they can basically go to college for free. That the world will bend over backward to help them succeed because we want to see them succeed, if only for selfish reasons. The more people from troubled communities succeed, the less trouble those communities are. I think that's probably also true of a lot of parts of rural and semi-rural America. I grew up in a city of about 250,000 people, so it's not exactly the countryside, but it's sort of isolated and has a kind of rural culture to it, even if it's a relatively good-sized city. But I think that a lot of those, that sense of being disconnected from the network of things that can help you to become successful in life is what they have in common.
So if we could go back to the drug crisis just quickly, because one thing more I wanted to hit on that. So what responsibility do the pharmaceutical companies have? You had Purdue Pharma a couple of weeks ago agreeing to what, I don't know, what was it, $8.5 billion settlement. How much, if any, responsibility do they bear for pushing these drugs?
Yeah, Jay wrote a great piece, Jay Norlinger for National Review, about an Indian reservation where he spent some time. And this reservation had banned alcohol. So you couldn't sell alcohol on the reservation because they had so much trouble with alcoholism. And there was a gas station, like a mile away. And then after this ban passed, that gas station started to sell, I think it was literally 1 million cans of beer a year. Something like that, some absurd number. Now, they had to know what was going on. They know who their customers are. They know that suddenly their business went up. I think that the people selling prescription drugs are in much the same situation where, in a general way, they must have known that something was up. They must have known that there wasn't, some horrible series of industrial accidents, and suddenly there were millions of Americans who needed years and years of prescription painkillers, whereas they hadn't before. In any given case, were they making a sale that they had reason to know that they shouldn't make? Well, probably not. I mean, the drug companies, of course, don't deal directly to the public anyway. They go through doctors and pharmacies and things. So, some of the big drugstores got into trouble for this stuff too, of not being especially careful about how this stuff happens. And I know of cases where there were significant amounts of prescription painkillers that were diverted in the legal system and ended up on the street somewhere. So there was criminality involved here. I don't really buy the story that Purdue was somehow out there sneakily convincing people to turn themselves into drug addicts so it could make some more money. I think that Purdue, like a lot of companies, saw an uptick in its consumption and tried real hard not to think about why it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So talk a little bit about how masculinity and different visions of masculinity play into this. You referred earlier when we were talking about work that a lot of these guys have never seen anyone work except for maybe some women in their lives. But these communities, I imagine, have a version of very traditional gender roles, but the men are falling down by what we would consider any reasonable standards.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the white working class, but the real problem is the white non-working class, and the non-working classes more generally. So one of the pieces in the book is a report from Midland, Texas, where there are a lot of very good blue collar jobs for men, thanks to the oil and gas business. Although recently that's run into some difficult times, but kind of the nature of that business. I talked to a guy out there who was, I don't know if he finished high school, he certainly wasn't a college graduate. He described his job as mixing mud, which means he was, putting together fracking fluids. He was 21 years old. He was making $95,000 a year, which even in Midland's pretty good money. It's not, maybe it doesn't go that far in Georgetown, but it's pretty good money in Midland, Texas, even as expensive as Midland is compared to the rest of the places around it. And so he had a place in life he could feel pretty good about, I think, and pretty comfortable about. A lot of the things, let me back up a little bit. I mean, one of the problems for men and the idea of masculinity in the 21st century is that traditional masculinity is sort of beside the point in many ways. So the things that men have particularly been good at historically are things like violence,
Right.
fighting, enforcing the law, fighting off invaders, doing very, very hard physical things, exhibiting physical courage. And I think that those are all still important in some ways. We need them for soldiers and cops and other sorts of people, but it's not something that creates a lot of social value if you are working at a Fortune 500 company. There are not a lot of people that, Microsoft doesn't have ads out that say, we need someone, we want to pay you $100,000 a year, and you need to be able to deadlift 600 pounds and, work on your feet and take a punch. So these sorts of traditional masculine virtues have been devalued just by the nature of economic production. And combining that with the fact that so many people now delay marriage, delay parenthood, other things that have cut people off from traditional sources of status and meaning and community. You've got this population of men, many of whom don't have any kind of male role models in their lives because they didn't have their fathers around, who have this traditional sort of masculine energy, which we're still going to have because our society evolves pretty quickly, but as a species, we don't evolve that quickly. We're physically the same, people we were 100,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. So they've got this energy, they've got these masculine traits that they don't have any way to express or create any value with. And I think it's a real difficult situation. Things that we used to admire in men, and including in men who didn't make a lot of money, but it was things like, endurance and reliability. And he went to work every day and did this very hard and thankless job, and he kept doing it. That used to be something that maybe didn't make you a lot of money, but earned you some respect. And now we've taken away the respect as well, I think. I think that we really as a society need to stop thinking of people who work in jobs that don't require a college degree as chumps and as losers.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many times I've seen someone who has built a successful business and a happy life and a good family, and had someone say, if he'd only gone to college, he really could have done something with his life.
Right.
You get that all the time.
Yeah, I was a couple of years ago, I was looking for an assistant, an administrative assistant, and I interviewed a guy who stuck in my mind who was Gary Cohn's assistant at Goldman Sachs, and ended up not being a good match for NR for various reasons. But he didn't have a college degree. It was one of these things where he started to go to college, something happened with his family, and there's a financial problem, and he had to drop out. And he was just sort of stuck, like really a bright guy. But even a lot of assistant jobs, administrative assistant jobs, they would say college degree required.
Yeah.
When, that's not a job that requires a college degree. My job doesn't require your job doesn't require a college degree. But
Which is good because I don't have one.
Yes, well, there you go. And but we've made it this badge of merit that locks people out and makes them feel disrespected, and gets them into some of them into a funnel where they try to go to college, and maybe they just go 2 years, or maybe they go 6 years and still don't get a degree and rack up a lot of debt and learn no life skills. It's a travesty.
When I was in college, I remember I applied for an internship at the Wall Street Journal. And the first thing they asked me was, "Are you a journalism major?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, congratulations, you just cleared the first step." Because we don't hire those. And years later, I was interviewing a guy for a job in Philadelphia at a newspaper I was running there. And it was an older guy, kind of middle-aged. And he was all kind of, depressed and down at the mouth in the interview, and like really just sort of bummed, and not the way people normally behave in job interviews. And I was like, "Dude, what's wrong? Do we need to talk about something? Do you need you need a cup of coffee or what?" And he was like, "Well, I don't have a journalism degree." And I was like, "Great. I never hired anyone with a journalism degree. I don't ever expect to hire anyone with a journalism degree." And then he said, "Well, I don't actually have a college degree at all." I was like, "Don't care. Can you do the job?" And what I ended up doing was saying, "Come work for me for a month. And if you're any good at it, we'll know. And if you're not, then at least you got paid for a month, and you're no worse off than you were before." And he turned out to be, terrific at it. In fact, he became the editor after I left. So the 4-year BA as a kind of social professional general qualification is just nonsensical. First of all, it's generally useless. Outside of pretty rigorous and elite universities, all a 4-year degree means is that you can be counted on to show up and do what you're told for a few hours a day, 5 days a week, which I suppose is a useful indicator of something for certain kinds of corporate employment. But it's not, a badge of creativity or anything else. And yeah, I mean, I could go on about undergraduate education all day, but I'm always perplexed by some of it. And I remember when I was at UT, the business school there was a really big deal, and getting into the UT business school was a big deal. And I kind of understand MBAs and that sort of thing, but I've never really understood the undergraduate degree in business management. So I'm 22 and I have a BA in business management. Let me come manage your business. I've never done anything, but.
Right. So in these communities, where are the churches, and what role does religion play? Because you alluded this to earlier, in a difference between being poor, where everyone's poor and there's no social capital, and being poor in places where there is some social capital. Clarence Thomas's memoir, which is one of the best memoirs of the last 30 years, gets to this point. He grew up in one of the poorest places in the United States, but didn't have a poor upbringing because his grandparents were desperate to impart discipline and to make sure he got educated and to make sure he went to church. And it just seems in a lot of these communities that those factors where you should be there have fallen off. Yeah,
Justice Thomas is a great example of this. I grew up in a place that was not only poor, but also a place where people don't speak English.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Raised in a Gullah-speaking community, and became just an extraordinary man and a very fine writer, she said. I think the churches have really fallen down on the job on this, to be honest. The old school kind of mainline Protestant churches have essentially become social clubs. And they don't offer much for young people, but it doesn't matter because they don't have any young congregants. We had a terrible storm here a couple of years ago in Dallas, and we went to go to help one of the churches to clean up afterward. And they couldn't really do it themselves because the median age of their congregant was 71 or something like that. Wow. So they weren't able to go, pick up the mess. Some of the churches, I think, have been, kind of poisoned by politics. This is particularly true on the evangelical side, and they see that as their social mission. But yeah, I think churches could do a lot to help connect people and build those networks to connect people to social capital. The other thing, and Charles Murray gets into this sometimes, is spare a thought for standardized testing. Standardized testing is not enormously helpful to everyone across the board, but it's very, very helpful to gifted and academically inclined people in communities that don't have a lot of those kinds of resources. And when we test people in, first, second, third, fifth, and seventh grade, and do so in a rigorous way, you can really identify people who have some untapped intellectual and academic talent. And we're really good as a society about helping those people along once we've identified them. The United States education system tends to be really good with dealing with people at the top, pretty good at dealing with people at the very bottom, people who have special needs and learning disabilities and that sort of thing. Not a very good job with the people in the middle. And part of that, I think, is this one-size-fits-all attitude toward education that is oriented toward how do we get these students into college? And we judge high schools that way sometimes. You're a successful high school if 92% of your graduates go to college. I think that's really the wrong way to look at that. There's a lot more that could be done with vocational training. We should distinguish really and make a really bright line distinction between education that is essentially classical liberal arts education that's about cultivation and self-improvement, and education that is job training and preparing people for work and professional life. These are just two different things, and treating them as though they're the same thing, being handled by the same personnel in the same classrooms in the same institutions, I think is a mistake and always has been a mistake. But again, it's one of those examples of the fact that Americans have a really hard time drawing social distinctions. Because if we say, well, this is, higher education and this is vocational training, somebody on one side of that's going to feel like they've been slighted, like they're being looked down at by the other. And they're probably not wrong about that, but it still would produce better results for people than trying to shove a bunch of people into go get English degrees from third-rate colleges who don't really want to read a book.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about what is to be done, if anything, about all this. One of your proposals that you caught a lot of flack for was the idea, if you're in a community that has suffered economic dislocation and where there's no social capital and there are no prospects for you, move, just move. And a lot of people take great umbrage at that. Discuss that.
I think that our policy should be oriented toward people, not toward places. There are great famous cities of antiquity that don't exist anymore. There are a million cities along the old Silk Route that aren't there anymore because the economic basis of their existence just disappeared, as happens from time to time. That doesn't mean that we abandon the people, even if we decide that our priority isn't going to be the particular place. So yeah, I've talked about things like repackaging unemployment benefits as relocation benefits for people who want to move somewhere to get a better job, but who don't have the resources to move, which can be very difficult and very expensive, and often stops people from taking better jobs. And that's something that we actually can do something about, I think, as a relatively easy policy fix. But yeah, so this is my old debate with Michael Brendan Doherty about Garbutt, which was his choice, not mine, by the way. So people of Garbutt, write to Michael, don't write to me. The town I grew up in Lubbock, actually isn't the original Lubbock, Texas. There were originally two cities out there. One was called Caprock and one was called Lubbock. And they eventually discovered there just wasn't enough settlement and economic activity to support two cities. So they had a meeting and they decided just to abandon one of them, which was the original Lubbock. And its only real asset was it was where they had a hotel. And so they disassembled the hotel and put it on wagons and dragged the wagons across the prairie to the city of Caprock, which they renamed Lubbock, and that's now Lubbock, Texas. And you can go out and find the ruins of old Lubbock somewhere out there in the wilderness still. Cities come and go, and we may have attachments to them. There's, Michael has a decent point about the kind of Burkean value of local places. But at some point, our question for these places that are just economically not sustainable is that we're either going to help the people there become economically self-sufficient by doing some kind of work, which generally is going to mean moving for most of them, or we're going to maintain them in some kind of dependency indefinitely. And I don't hear a lot of conservatives who want to make the case for indefinite welfare dependency for large parts of the country, but that's essentially the case they're making without stepping up and saying so. This is not something that's going to be fixed by putting aluminum tariffs on the Canadians and all the rest of the nonsensical things that we hear about as nostrums for these areas. So it's pretty much A or B. They're either going to become independent or they're going to be dependent, and we're going to pay for them to be dependent.
So let's shift around and talk a little bit about you, Kevin Williamson.
Okay.
So, when I do this call with accomplished writers, I like to talk a little bit about the craft of writing, get a little insight into how writers work. So are you a morning guy as a writer, an evening guy, or does it not make any difference? Are you an at-home guy, a coffee shop guy, a library guy? Give us some insight.
I'm increasingly a morning guy. I used to be more of an afternoon guy, but I think that probably had to do with the fact that I used to drink a lot more and I didn't feel great often in the mornings. So, I'm a sort of go to bed at 9, get up at 5 o'clock guy now. And you can get a lot of work done before the rest of the world gets up at 7:30. So I like to do that. One thing I have done that's it's a little bit of a crutch, but it's been amazingly useful, is I bought one of those little electric word processors that doesn't have an internet connection. So it doesn't have a web browser, email, or anything like that.
So you're not
what's that?
You're not distracted?
Right. So you can go somewhere and write, and there's nothing you can do except write.
Oh, that's a good idea.
I don't use social media, and I haven't for some years now, but I've actually set up my computer that it blocks that stuff. So I can't even look at it if I try to. And it's enough work to do the workaround that you won't bother doing it. I find I can write for about 4 hours, maybe at a go. After 4 hours, I need an hour or two of doing something else. So I like to write in the mornings. Then I usually turn to doing some, daily journalism reading later in the morning, and whatever book it is that I'm reading at the time, and then turn back to it in the afternoon try to go to the gym at some point during that, which I find is a good intellectual reset for me. So you can kind of turn the brain off for a while and then turn it back on. But yeah, I still get the thing where sometimes I'll find a moment of inspiration and I'll sit down and I'll write 10,000 words. And some days it's hard to knock out 700. It just sort of depends.
And how are you on drafting? How many drafts typically you go through before you have something the way you want it?
I spent most of the first part of my career as an editor. So editing comes pretty naturally to me, and I'm a reasonably good editor of my own work, I think. Jason Stewart's might have different views of that. Let's not ask him. I tend to revise stuff pretty much as I go. So I write a sentence, I look at it, sometimes I'll change it a little bit. I do the same thing at the end of a paragraph. But usually by the time I've got to the end of a piece, I'll read through it once more typically and maybe change some things, make a few corrections, but I can generally get something pretty close to a finished product with one sustained piece of effort.
And do you start at the beginning? Do you wait until you have a lead or a top anecdote and get that down and go? Or
often, particularly on the big reported pieces, something will jump out and you'll go, okay, well, that's the lead. Obviously, here's the interesting character, or here's someone who said something that is kind of a fun quotation. So I'll jump off from there. Generally, I will just sit down and start writing, but then what ends up being the lead in the first paragraph might be different. So I might, once I've written, half a piece, I'll start thinking, oh, here's what I should do. And I'll go back and throw that on there. Every now and then I write, headline, subhead, byline, lead sentence through to the end, and that's that. Often, because on the reporting trips, I like to drive, and I kind of compose while I drive. So one of the nice things about having a 6 or 7 hour drive is that you can pretty well think through a piece by the time you get to the end of your drive, and then just sit down and type it out.
So a lot of us, Kevin, read a Kevin Williamson piece and like, wow, I wish I could have written that, or I wish I would have put it that way or thought of it that way. Who do you read and have those kind of feelings when you read them?
Yeah, when I was a youngster, the people who really got me sort of excited about writing as something I thought I might want to do were, not to pander to the home audience here, but certainly Bill Buckley was a big part of that. His columns were just a real art form of writing the 700-word column. He was just terrific at. I'm a big fan of David Foster Wallace, as I think everyone knows, because I occasionally steal from him or put little subtle references to him in pieces that other DFW nerds will get. Well, the big, porn piece on Las Vegas was essentially rewriting something that he did back in the 90s from the same event. I thought it was time to update that. A huge fan of Hunter Thompson, particularly the really early stuff before he started basically playing the character of Hunter Thompson, in Hell's Angels and that kind of
That's
stuff.
An amazing book of first-person reportage. The late stuff I find totally unreadable, but that is an amazing book.
Yeah. Tom Wolfe, obviously. So I often say one of the best insults I ever got in my life was from our friend, the late Mike Patemra. I turned in a piece that was kind of uncharacteristically sober for me. And I said, I'm sorry if this one seems a little dull. And Mike said, that's okay. Even Tom Wolfe doesn't try to write like Tom Wolfe all the time, which he could be a rat bastard sometimes, but he was a funny man. So those guys were a huge influence on me. I read Tom Wolfe for years before I figured out that he was a conservative. I just thought he was an interesting guy with interesting things to say. I remember I picked up a copy of the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test at a garage sale for 25 cents. And yeah, it was like discovering a new little world of different things you could do with writing. So I think you have to be careful about using too much literary license in journalism and relying too heavily on literary techniques. Some lady over at that other magazine got into trouble a couple of weeks ago for, kind of inventing a composite character, I guess, and changing some details of a story to make it a little more dramatic. But when you're writing a piece, particularly if you're writing a long piece, I think that in addition to asking people for their money to buy your magazine or your book, you're also asking them for their time. You know, it's an investment of time and energy to go through a 5,000 word story or a 65,000 word book. So I think it's incumbent upon us to try to at least make it entertaining, you know, and I like to write sentences that I think I would like reading. You know, I tend to write stuff that I would enjoy if I were reading it, I think, and then trust that other people who have similar tastes will enjoy it as well. It doesn't always work, you know. Sometimes I'll go back and look at something and I'll think, yeah, I was trying a little too hard on that one and just didn't quite land the way I wanted it to. But you know, if 7 times out of 10 you go back and you're satisfied with something, that's a pretty good number for a writer.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Kevin, we think it always works. And you're a jewel in the journalistic universe and an adornment to National Review. And Bill Buckley would be so proud of your work, and I'm proud to publish it. And thanks for making the time today. Congratulations on the book. Thanks for everyone for joining the call. It's really too bad we can't see each other in person, but a side benefit is that we can have bigger events, you know, putting on an event with hundreds and hundreds of people. Lindsay does it all the time, but it's a heavy lift. So at least it's much easier on these Zoom calls. We appreciate your interest. I appreciate your support of National Review Institute. It's really important. It makes it possible to support the work of Kevin and so many of other wonderful writers. So we really appreciate your generosity. And if you can see through to give more and give again this year, we'd really appreciate it. And please, I'll also remind everyone, sign up for NR Plus. The digital subscription service on nationalreview.com has been growing by leaps and bounds. It's your way to get away from the annoying meter paywall, to see basically no more ads on the site, which can be really obnoxious and distract you when you're trying to focus on a Kevin Williamson piece. So everyone, thanks again. Kevin, congratulations. We'll see everyone soon. God bless, and God bless America.
Thank you all for coming.